Okay, so just been reading Luke 7, and I'm starting round about verse 40. The context is that there was this Pharisee, which was, I suppose, like the scribes and Pharisees in the most part were the enemy of Jesus, because they were quite jealous of him, for what he'd got. They politically had got the temple and a religious structure, and people were following them. And politically, they were seen as the highest religion authority with the Romans, so they had like political power there and position. And yet Jesus comes along, heals all these people, and then all of a sudden loads of people are following them. Now there's one guy called Simon who's a Pharisee, and he goes and eats with Jesus. And then there's this like sinner lady that comes in and does these things to Jesus, and it kind of disgusts him a little bit. And he starts to say to himself, like, if Jesus was a real prophet, he would know that this lady is a sinner. So I have doubts about him. But yet he still wanted to see Jesus. So he was probably in this position of, although he's like in the group of an enemy of Jesus, he may be starting to be persuaded that, he is the Messiah, I suppose. And in verse 40, where I'm starting, it says, "And Jesus answered and said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he said, Master, say on. There was a certain creditor, which the two debtors, the one owed 500 pence, and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most?" So will it be the one with 10 times the amount of debt, or the one with the small amount of debt? And Simon, he judged correctly. He said, it's the one with the highest amount of debt. They're the one that's going to love that master the most. And he's right, But then in verse 44, he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, See thou this woman, which remember is the sinner that Simon was disgusted by. I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou givest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, have not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman have anointed my feet with her ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. So she loved Jesus much because she recognized that she was a sinner, and that Jesus forgave her all of her sins, and there were many of them. Now, I myself have not been the biggest sinner. I've done some bad things, but I'm not like a lot of other people that I know. I know Christians that had all sorts of strange, sinful issues, that have been involved, from like mafia to drug dealers to all sorts of crazy things. And like when they understand that God's forgiven them, they will love much, because they realise that they've been forgiven much, they've been born again, they've been given this new life, and they love that God died to pay off all of their sin, so that they can be counted righteousness through belief in Jesus. So like, where does that leave me? Does that mean then that I don't love God as much as them, because they've been forgiven much, whereas I've been forgiven, I suppose, much less? Well, this is an interesting kind of perspective, because in my view, I feel like I probably love God the same as they love him. I probably love Jesus just as much as they do. So how can that be if I've been forgiven less? Well, I don't know if I can make a biblical argument for this. So you're going to have to use discernment. This could be personal opinion, which is why I'm warning you about it. But I think that I love just as much as them, because Jesus died for me and Jesus died for them. It was the same sacrifice. Now that sacrifice is immensely holy. In fact, it's got an infinite value. It's a value that we can't comprehend. You know, God's only son. You know, if I had a son, I wouldn't want to sacrifice my son so that other people can be forgiven. And yet the heart of God is that he was willing to do that. And the Son, who's in complete agreement with the Father, had the same heart. And he was obedient all the way unto death. You know, he died on that cross to pay off the sin for the whole of the world, for those that believe in that payment and believe in his death, his burial and resurrection. So Jesus is this value that we can't even comprehend. But the thing is, as a Christian, and this is where I get into personal opinion now, the thing is, as a Christian, you love Jesus, and I love Jesus, but I sort of see myself as someone who killed Jesus. And the reason I see myself as someone that killed Jesus is because God's plan to redeem humanity was that Jesus would have to die on the cross. It was the only way to go. And I think somewhere it says in the Bible, Jesus says that to receive a gift of salvation, you have to receive it humbly as a little child. And you know, I receive that gift. I see that cross, and I know that that's what's paid off my sin, and I take it, and I'm happy for it, because I know it's the only way out. It's the only way out for me to be forgiven, and it's the only way in which God went. I recognise that sacrifice was perfect to redeem me, but I believe that I killed Jesus, and the reason I believe that is because it was the only way for humanity to be redeemed. He had to die, and because I recognise that I'm a sinner, he had to die for my sin. And because it was me that committed the sin, I have to have him to die for something that I've done. So I committed the crime, and he died for me. So I committed the crime, and because he died for me, I had to kill Jesus on that cross. If I didn't sin, if I didn't take that sacrifice, then I would be innocent of the death of Jesus. But I would still be guilty of the sin that I've got. And it's a catch-22 with God. You know, you can either carry the sins that you've got and be found guilty at judgment, and then basically, go into hell. That's what the Bible says. Or you can accept Jesus, understand that your sin cost the life of God's Son, but by believing in that sacrifice and accepting that payment for your sin can be paid off in full and completely forgotten about from God's perspective. And justice is served through that. You know, the sin that I've committed, I'll give you an example. I lied once. That sin that I've committed has been paid off through the death of Jesus Christ. So that sin now is not accounted to me. He takes away all of my sins, but he gives me his righteousness. And in order for that to happen, Jesus had to go to the cross for me personally, and I was the one that committed the crime. So I committed the crime of killing Jesus. Now, when I recognise that Jesus is of an infinite value, what that means is that I recognise that my sin was so grievous it cost the life of God's beloved Son. So when I look at that, I realise that I have committed the ultimate sin. I've killed God's Son. And because I've done that, I recognise that it still had it paid off, still had that sin paid off through his death, but I recognize that I have been forgiven much, because I stood out in the crowd that was mocking Jesus when he was being killed, even though I wasn't actually physically there. He still had to suffer the painful death because of the crime that I committed. So therefore, I love just as much as anybody. Jesus here says that to Simon, you may not love me as much as this sinner loves me who's committed all of these sins. But Simon in the future, I believe that when he realizes what God has done, the equality of love evens out in Christians, because they all have that foundation of Jesus Christ on the cross.